This is from December 28th. He writes stuff and nonsense. I'm just gonna kind of skip through it here. So he says, I took a few days off for the holidays. Shame on me. But now I'm back in the salt mine working on so many bloody things. My head is about to explode. Yes, Winds of Winter. Yes, yes. And House of the Dragon season 2. And several of the other successor shows that we're developing with HBO. Some of those are moving faster than others, as is always the case. None have been greenlit yet, though we are hoping, maybe soon. A couple have been shelved. I wouldn't say they're dead. You can always take something off the shelf as easily as you can put it on it. But, the changes at HBO Max have impacted us, certainly.
He's still working on Wins is a positive.
That's a positive, yes. But I guess more so the successor shows.
Yeah, I think everything's in trouble right now at HBO a little bit. It did not appear that it was a very positive change of the schedule. Some have been shelved, as he says, and the one thing he did say is if it can be put on the shelf, it can also be taken off the shelf. But it certainly seems as if the direction at Warner Brothers, Discovery, HBO is changing a bit, and they're cutting costs. And one of the articles that I saw that responded to this was talking about the cost of shows and the ratings they bring and the revenue they bring. And yes, House of the Dragon is one of the most successful shows on television right now, but it costs a lot of money to make that. And we're not sure what that return on investment really looks like as far as new subs, merchandise, and all this stuff goes. So I think, unfortunately, with the cost cutting with this new CEO is he's looking and saying, well, we need less of that and a lot more of the low budget reality stuff that like Discovery is known for. Not that I think those things are going to be on HBO, the channel. So, that's at least good. At least we'll keep HBO kind of siloed off and still doing high quality things. But even things like a White Lotus, which has been very popular for HBO recently, nowhere near the budget of House of the Dragon. I'm assuming that. They do have a little bit more notable actors, so maybe they spend a little bit more money there. But in a way, it's very discouraging because I'm not just a House of the Dragon, Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire fan. I'm also an HBO fan. And when I see things like this and kind of changing directions, with new people at the helm, it is scary because HBO to me is like the last bastion of like really true prime TV. I do know that, speaking of prime TV, I know Amazon is doing a lot of things and Netflix has stuff and everyone has their favorite services. But for me, for the last 3 decades, HBO has been, the one place I can count on 99% of the time to do something at least compelling or different. And I don't like it. I don't like this news, not just because of the future of like Westeros TV, but also just HBO in general as a fan.
Yeah. So I think some of the key takeaways from this, well, for starters, just a little backstory, right? So for maybe people who are just listening to us, because we always get a lot of new listeners at the beginning of the year. So sort of, if you're unfamiliar as to kind of what's going on and how this sort of impacts Game of Thrones is Warner Brothers, who owns HBO, right, who owns the TV rights to Game of Thrones and all of the Westeros content, was owned by AT&T, who acquired a lot of debt in order to buy them. They had to sort of, after a couple of years, shelve that debt. So Discovery sort of stepped in, merged / bought them, but now they've taken on a lot of debt in order to acquire this. I think in the long run, I do still kind of think it will be better that a content company is in control of all of this stuff as opposed to a phone company, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's still probably for the best. Now, the interesting thing he says here, well, first, if we go through it, so he says, we're still working on a lot of the successor shows, which again, remember the first time we heard successor shows, we were all thinking what he means is prequels. Then we got the news about Jon Snow I was like, okay, well, that is truly a successor show, right? As in it would take place after. He doesn't comment onto any of the titles, even though some of them have been leaked. Certainly the Jon Snow show he's mentioned before. He says some are moving faster than others. Now, for that case, I would assume that some of these obviously are still going to be happening. And by saying some of those, that to me comes across as plural. So at least 2, right, of these shows. So I would say Snow and possibly something else. None has been greenlit yet, though we're hoping maybe soon. A couple have been shelved. Some of the other ones they had potentially talked about was like the 10,000 ships and about Nymeria, and there was talks of like a Corlys Valerion, right? Like prequel. Which honestly, both of those, I'm interested, but if you're saying it's going to be that or Duncan Egg and a Jon Snow show, well, it's like, okay, we can definitely shelve those, at least for my personal interest. But then he says that all of the changes at HBO Max have impacted us. He didn't say HBO. He said all the things at HBO Max, which is just the streaming service, because we know that HBO Max is going to be getting merged with Discovery Plus and make some sort of new thing. And it sounds like some of that original HBO Max, Discovery Plus, whatever it's going to be, content is going to be sort of different than what we're getting now, which is like basically just HBO shows on a streaming service like you find with Disney and stuff like that. So that's kind of interesting. My guess is that what might be happening, because I would still imagine that if you're Warner Brothers and you're looking at the success of Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, just like they want to build up DC and revitalize Harry Potter, these other wells they can tap into, you obviously want to keep the Westeros well running, since that's the big pillar of HBO. But if some of these things aren't going to be developed specifically for streaming, then you're sort of working with TV schedules and HBO, and that could throw some things off or cause you to need to push some things back, because you still have other big shows that appear on HBO, then ultimately find their way to HBO Max, and that's like a scheduling thing. So maybe that's the silver lining.
Yeah, I'm hoping so. And to be honest, and we've kind of talked about this before here on the podcast, like I'm not opposed to slowing down. This is something that we could have Westerosi type of TV for decades if we just space out these shows. Maybe the last season of House of the Dragon is maybe when I'm just throwing stuff out, but like Snow begins. Like I don't necessarily want all these shows running in line. One, I think it's too expensive. And whenever you go down that path, if you have something that fails, it gets axed, because it's like, this is so much money, like it has to perform, right? So I do feel like that could be a good thing if they're saying, hey, let's steady this drip out and not turn on the faucet. I'm actually cool with that. I'm going to remain optimistic for once in my life, and I'm going to say that is what they're going to be doing.
Yeah, I think that, and I'm sort of with you. I don't know that honestly I would want more than House of the Dragon and Snow potentially running like every other year.
Yes.
Right. So it's like you get Snow this year and you get this year. I think one of the things you look over at Disney, and they're sort of in the opposite, where they're like crank out as absolute much as possible. Mm-hmm. I think the easiest things to look at are Marvel and Star Wars. With Marvel, it's almost like fatigue. I mean, it's like it's hard to keep up. I don't even, I know like Loki season 2 is coming, all these things, but you have to have watched like 30 movies and like 10 Disney Plus shows, and it's a lot. So it can become quite a bit. And that's a story that's really mostly goes in like a pretty much straight timeline. Yeah, there's a couple prequels and things that happen here and there. The other thing that could get, I think, kind of confusing is with Star Wars. That's sort of their other big pillar over there, is you're constantly jumping back and forth in their timeline, right? So you have big shows like The Mandalorian, which take place after Return of the Jedi, but before Force Awakens. And then you have shows like Andor, which take place before Rogue One, which takes place before Episode 4, but after Kenobi. And it's a lot. And it's like, it's hard to keep track of. And with Westeros, I think it's just kind of easier to sort of just go look at House of the Dragon, and they start the show and they're like, hey, 150 years before Daenerys Targaryen. Okay, easy. Now we know where we're at. But then you don't have to jump to Jon, which is after. And then you have a Corlys Valerion show where that's a prequel to him in House of the Dragon. So I think it's just easier. I'm with you. Like maybe just 2 is fine.
Yeah, I think so. And another thing is, like, I hope that whenever they start expanding to these other shows, there's obviously going to be tie-ins, because like Westeros is very interconnected, and like that's why this is so much fun for us to do a podcast about and talk about it for years. But at the same time, I hope that they don't feel the need to always feel like there has to be a super strong connection between the shows. Like obviously we have the prophecy being passed down, and that kind of connects everything back to the main show and House of the Dragon. And to be honest, it's a huge factor, but it also is kind of still separate a little bit to the main family drama that's going on, which is great. It's just kind of added drama and it works. But I hope, if they did a Nymeria show, like, it should just stand on its own. You know what I'm saying? Like, it really doesn't need to connect to anything else.
Yeah, agreed.